Next speaker is Tom Webb from University of Sheffield. Tom's an exotically named, he's a macroecologist, so he studies large patterns of distribution and abundance of organisms on quite a broad scale, both in terms of space and in time as well. Tom's going to be talking to us about fisheries.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, we're going to stay below the waves for this talk, and what I want to do is to put fish centre stage for me. Fish in the Irish Sea are really important for a number of reasons, and of course, one of the main reasons that you're probably thinking of in this audience will be thinking of is as food for fish, as food for birds, but fish are also food for us, and the Irish Sea supports really important commercial fisheries. There are over 2,000 vessels licensed to fish in the Irish Sea, and they catch quite a lot, which we know because this fishery is well regulated, it's well recorded, and the Marine Management Organisation collates statistics, so you can look into the Marine Management Organisation reports and pull out statistics. So this shows you which species are caught in terms of the number of tonnes landed for a variety of species. These are the most important commercial species in the Irish Sea. In the red we have demersal fish species, so those living in the sea bottom. In green we've got a couple of pelagic species, herring and mackerel. And blue shows that there's some really important shell fisheries in the Irish Sea as well. And the bottom line here is that in 2012 over 40,000 tonnes of fish and shellfish were landed from the Irish Sea. It's a valuable fishery too. This shows those same landings in terms of value. This is just the value of the catch for the same species. And for some of the shellfish species, we have £10 million plus fisheries. There's £100,000 plus fisheries for quite a few of these species as well. And the value of the catch alone from the Irish Sea is more than £50 million, it was in 2012. The fishery also supports a lot of jobs. In fact, Milford Haven, as an administrative port, employs more fishermen than any other port in the UK. And in general, the fishery supports thousands of jobs, both directly and indirectly as well. There's another kind of fishing as well, though, which we're increasingly starting to realise is important, and that's recreational sea angling. This isn't really regulated, and it's harder to get precise statistics, but DEFRA commissioned a big survey last year called Sea Angling 2012 to look at sea angling habits in the UK. It's primarily focused on England, this report, but I think we can pull out some general trends anyway. There are over 1 million sea anglers in the UK. It's £1 billion a year industry, sea angling is, and it catches a lot of fish, more than 10 million fish caught a year in the UK, with quite significant quantities of some commercially important species. 200 tonnes of bass, 400 tonnes of cod. These are quantities that are kind of on a par with some of the commercial landings. So basically fish are a big deal in the Irish Sea, and they have been, of course, for generations, for centuries. So it's really important, if we're going to continue to use this valuable resource, that we're able to count what's in the sea this year, to try and predict what's going to be in the sea next year, and to try and give guidance as to what's a sustainable amount that we can take out of the sea. And we started to realise some time ago now that this means going beyond simply counting what's been caught. Fishermen are extremely good predators. If you want to know where fish are in the sea, ask a fisherman, they'll go and catch it. They focus on areas where there are a lot of fish. If you want a good picture of exactly how many fish there are in the environment, you need to sample the areas where there aren't so many fish as well. And so we need fisheries-independent surveys. And as I say, that's been recognised for a long time, and there's been long-term monitoring of the seas around Britain, including the Irish Sea, for decades now. And the particular monitoring that I'm going to talk briefly about is the bottom trawl surveys. So these are basically fishing boats trawling, but for scientific rather than commercial purposes. These have been going on for 35 years in the Irish Sea, and each year about 100 locations are sampled in the same kind of way, and over the years more than 100 fish species have been recorded. That's about 2/3 of the fish species which we know occur in the Irish Sea. Although actually, if you look at the actual abundances of what's been caught, the catches are dominated by just 3 species, dab, plaice and solomate. They account for more than 50% of the total abundance of species caught in these trawls. The purpose of these trawls was to monitor the fish populations, and they've been really effective at doing that. We've got good data now on many fish species over decades. We can monitor these populations. And because similar trawl surveys have been replicated across Europe and standardised, and the results compiled by the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, what we end up with is a continent-wide management resource that's really significant. But what interests me as an ecologist is some of the serendipitous decisions which were made towards the beginning of these long-term monitoring programs. So, for instance, a decision was made at the beginning not just to focus on commercially important fish species, but to count everything that came up in the nets. So we then have a much better idea of the full community of fish occurring in the Irish Sea and elsewhere. There have been projects to subsample what's been caught and look at gut contents and so on, so we have some idea about what these fish are eating. And also, a really key decision at the beginning of these surveys was not simply to identify and count all individuals that were caught, but to measure them as well. So for these surveys we have, for each individual that's been caught, we know what species it was and we know how big it was. And this has led to results that were probably never envisaged by the people setting up these surveys. There's been a whole branch of ecological theory based around thinking of organisms in terms of their body size rather than their species. And I've just picked an example here because it's a very recent publication. This is a very theoretical paper. It's a theoretical treatment of diversity in the marine environment based on thinking about things in terms of their body size. And it's been stimulated by these kinds of long-term monitoring surveys which were set up for completely different reasons. But there's a nice symmetry in that it's sort of coming full circle. Another recent paper here, which is using the theory of these size structure models and feeding that back into management and thinking about trade-offs between, in this case, between fisheries and conservation. So I think there's a really nice kind of symbiosis here between monitoring data which were collected for one reason, being repurposed for another reason and driving forward ecological theory, which can then feed back into the original purpose of the monitoring data. And the other key thing to say is that nobody would believe these models if we didn't have the data to back them up. So those long-term data are incredibly important in ground truthing these sorts of models. The other aspect that I wanted to talk about today is moving away from fish and the things that eat fish and thinking about the things that fish eat and putting fish within their ecosystem. Because for a long time the idea has been around that we can, perhaps one way of predicting fish abundance is to monitor their food supply, and often that means zooplankton. Sir Alister Hardy had this idea back in the 1920s, and by the 1930s, he had come up with a device called the Continuous Plankton Recorder device, which resulted in the Continuous Plankton Recorder Survey. This is a relatively simple device which is towed behind ships of opportunity, so you don't need a research vessel for this, you just need to find a ferry or a container ship or something that's prepared to tow one of these devices, which will then send the sample back inshore to scientists to analyse. The CPR survey has been running since the early 1930s, and really since the 1950s we've got good comparable data every year. Spatially pretty extensive. This just shows the main CPR survey routes in the North Atlantic area. So we've got routes covering large parts of the North Atlantic. And when you have a long time series and you pull data out of that, you can start to show interesting things. This is from a paper by Gregory Bogram from a few years ago now, which basically looked at the plankton communities around Britain and showed that when you contrast the 1960s and 70s with the late 1990s, we see that all the cold water species have moved off to the Arctic and all the warm water species are coming up through the Bay of Biscay, and that's now the plankton community that we have around Britain, which has this change in community of plankton has pretty far-reaching ecological implications. Now I could go on and give a lot of case studies of trends from the CPR survey, trends from the bottom trawl surveys. But instead I'm just going to go on a minor statistical digression, which I hope is going to be reasonably clear. This is a time series of sea surface temperature from the 1920s to the present day, and I've split this time series into decades. And the blue lines in each decade give an indication of what the trend is within that decade. And for most of the decades, well, most of them are pretty flat. There's a couple where it looks like there's been a bit of warming. There's a couple where it even looks like there's been a bit of cooling. But it's only when you paste together that full 90-year time series that you get the full picture here, which is lots of variation, but a really pronounced warming trend over the last few decades. And this length of time series is really important, particularly with something like climate, where we know that there are decadal scale cycles going on, and you're trying to pull out trends from within that. And then when you want to combine something to do with the environment, like temperature, with something to do with the effort that we're putting into fishing, this is trawling effort for cod through time, and maybe the biomass of cod through time, to get to something like how many cod are we actually able to bring to market through time. And you could put on how many guillemots of fledging or anything else for these kinds of time series. The key thing is that as soon as you're interested in more than 2 or 3 variables, then you need a long time series to have any power to detect any trends. And the other thing that you really need with a time series is not too many gaps. I'm going to go back to the CPR survey here. This is a reasonably lengthy quote, and I apologise for the amount of text here, but I thought it was important. This is from a paper by Richardson et al. From a few years ago, talking a bit about the history of the CPR survey, which reached its greatest coverage in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but contracted in the 1980s. And they talk about how this is a global phenomenon, that actually 40% of the long-term oceanographic monitoring programs, which were set up after World War II, were terminated during the 1980s. Largely because environmental monitoring at that point was considered poor science by administrators. Fortunately for the CPR, things turned around in the 1990s, and the negative perception of long-term monitoring changed. Global change became the primary issue, and we all thought we need to know what's happened in the past. We need these long-term data sets. And the CPR was saved and goes from strength to strength today. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and the very point when CPR coverage was at its lowest in the 1980s, really interesting things were happening in the marine environment around Britain, and in particular in the North Sea. There is still disputed, actually, whether there was a complete regime change in the mid-1980s, and one of the reasons it's disputed is because we don't have enough data to say for certain. It would be lovely to have the full CPR coverage through the 1980s. So that we could examine that properly, but the coverage dropped off then. And of course you can't kind of retrospectively add it. Nobody saw the regime change coming, and I think that's the point, as Tim was saying with the wreck this year, that you don't see these things coming. But if you've got the data in place and you're continuing to monitor, then you can understand them better. So I want to touch on now a new approach to marine ecosystem research, which is just getting underway in the UK. This is a major program, the Marine Ecosystems Research Program, or MERP, which is being funded by NERC and DEFRA to the tune of £5.5 million. So this is a really major investment to try and advance our understanding of marine ecosystems around the UK. The idea is to study the whole ecosystem, and we're going to be doing that with a focus on the western seas of the UK, including the Irish Sea. And doing lots of different things as part of this project. It led out of Plymouth, but in Sheffield we have quite major involvement as well. And there's a component of the project that I'm leading, which focuses on existing data, getting maximum use out of existing data. So this is doing things like using monitoring data for purposes that weren't necessarily foreseen by the originators, trying to match up different time series and look across the whole food web. And when we were writing the proposal, we were able to make the case that the UK seas are data rich, but actually, when you look into it, for most groups, for most marine groups, data are extremely scarce. I did a quick calculation there was a very extensive survey of bottom-living animals in the Irish Sea in the 1990s called Biomore, which surveyed stations throughout the Irish Sea. And if you look at it on a map, it looks incredibly impressive, and it is a very impressive survey. But if you add up the area of all of the core samples that were actually taken, so the actual area of sediment that was sampled, it's about 30 square metres, which is a small fraction of the area of this room, out of 100,000 square kilometres of Irish Sea. So we really are kind of feeling in the dark of it, and it's nicely encapsulated by John Sheffield, a very eminent fisheries biologist, who once said that counting fish is just like counting trees, except they're invisible and they keep moving. And it's really hard to sample stuff that lives underwater. And that's why there's been a lot of talk about the difficulties of working on seabirds, and I appreciate that, but we kind of look green-eyed with envy at the seabird data sets, because you at least have this short window at a critical life stage where you can study them really intensively. You can look at things like productivity, recruitment, you can look at survival of individuals. And these are incredible time series, and one of the things we hope to do within the new Marine Ecosystems Programme is to link up these time series with other marine time series. There are some good time series, I've talked about a couple of them, and other sampling data as well, to see what it is that seabirds can tell us about what's happening in the marine environment more generally. So that's really my message, I think. The other data sets will come and go, and we take advantage of them opportunistically when we can. But the long-term time series, the really high-quality ones, are really few and far between. But they're the kind of fixed points that we orient ourselves with when we're trying to work at a larger marine ecosystem scale. So, my view, monitoring is crucial to predicting the future of our seas in a changing world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Fascinating talk. I'm sure there'll be some questions.
Yeah, thanks very much for making that point at the end that the bird people have got it made when it comes to monitoring compared to what we poor buggers have to do in the sea. You showed one slide of pod landings, which, if people can remember it, makes a very important point that the figures you showed prior to that, looking at the landings, recent landings and values of landings, are a fraction, the populations are a fraction of what they were for most species, 50 years ago, a century ago, further back than that. And coming back to, you showed a picture of the administrative ports and number of people employed by us. Unfortunately, as Phil implied prior to in the previous talk, simplification can be misleading. And yes, as an administrative port, Milford Haven has got a huge number of fisher folk attached to it. The vast majority of those are Anglo-Spanish or Belgian or French flag of convenience registered vessels. The actual numbers of fishermen employed in Wales is around 500 full-time equivalent. The value of marine fisheries to Wales PLC is, according to the Welsh Government Statistics Unit, about £11 million. 11 million quid, which is peanuts. Unfortunately, the MMO don't disaggregate between England and Wales, so it's actually very, very difficult to tease out, what the various values are for Wales. And on the one hand, what I'm saying is that we need better monitoring data for fishing and fishing efforts in Wales, because we ain't really got it very well. But it just demonstrates how easily generic figures can be used to justify defending an industry, overly defending an industry, because it's actually worth very, very little to the Welsh economy and to the Welsh community.
That's a good point, and in the interest of putting up something comprehensible, obviously glossed over a lot of details. The figures that I put up were landings by UK registered vessels into UK ports. And yeah, so it is sort of a whole UK scale, but it doesn't look at exports or anything. It is possible from the MMO to get port level data, so it would be possible to
but even port level data doesn't reflect the reporter registry, for example.
Yeah. But of course, the other thing is that fishing has a great cultural value, which isn't captured by any of those figures either. So, you know, I think that's the reason the fishing industry has such a large voice in these debates. It's not, you know, the figure that's often kind of raised, and I don't know how apocryphal it is that in the UK the mushroom farming industry is worth more than the fishing industry. You don't have great lobbies of mushroom farmers, but it is that cultural importance, you know, which has groundings in lots of good historical reasons.
Chris?
You said you were agreeing with envy of the bird watchers being able to count things. I'm agreeing with envy at that 5.5 million. That would produce 700 summer field assistants for me.
Yes, yeah, and as soon as you bring research investment into the equation, that disappears quite quickly. I should have said as well that, you know, there are things we can do that you can't do with birds, like put fish in a blender and you know, do isotopic diet analysis and things quite easily. Destructive sampling has its plus side as well as its negative side.
We saw some interesting data with monkeys where they were feeding during incubation when they had youngsters or when they had chicks. Do we know how important those same areas are for the fishing industry? Bait and dog, for example.
It would be possible to find out. I don't know off the top of my head. But yeah, we can. There are various ways of finding that out. I mean, you can actually look at where the fish are, and you've got data on that now. But one of the things that all fishing boats, or legal fishing boats, have to carry now is a GPS transponder. I think that applies to all fishing boats. There may be a size restriction there, so small boats don't need it. So you can actually look at where people are actually going to fish. There are some issues with actually getting hold of the data because there's privacy issues there, but in theory it would be possible to superimpose those two maps. Yeah.
It's unfortunate that your catches didn't include a single fish that birds on scomber eat. The gannets will eat herrings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean they were just the fish that are commercially important. The other thing with the bottom trawl survey as well is you know, it's focused on fish that live near the bottom, so it's not good at catching sand eels and sprats and things. But there are other surveys doing that. They don't have quite the same history, but there are certainly surveys looking at the pelagic fish as well.
Okay, thanks, Tom. That's a really interesting session where both speakers kind of really underline the importance of these whole ecosystem approaches. It's not all about seabirds, obviously. And there seems to be quite a lot of potential for seabird data sets to link up with lots of other fishery studies, which I think Steve Otier may be talking about a little bit later on. He's not sure, maybe. But great, thank you very much to today's speakers. If you have a little blue star on your badge, then lunch is served where the coffee is, otherwise there's a coffee shop around here. You may eat your lunch around here. Please could everyone be back for 2 o'clock sharp for the next session, please. But thanks to everyone.